In our final segment here, we're going to talk a little bit about, I teased it at the beginning of the show, but what does failure look like to you? Success and failure, right? For a lot of different people, it's subjective, right? But for one particular person, this was recently making the headlines over the last couple of days as the NBA playoffs is in full swing. And the Milwaukee Bucks, the number one seed in the Eastern Conference. If you don't know what any of that means, that just means that they had the best record in the Eastern Conference, and they have arguably the best player in the NBA on their team in Giannis Antetokounmpo. Giannis was recently asked by a reporter as the season winded down because they lost 4-1 to the Miami Heat. He was asked about, is the season a failure? And his response took the sports world and even crossover news, everybody examining their career choices and trajectory. And everyone started to really break this down and have this philosophical debate about what is successful versus what is a failure. I'm going to play a little bit of what Giannis said here to the reporter in response. Then Nick and I are going to give our takes. Take a listen to this.
You asked me the same question last year, Eric. Okay. Do you get the promotion every year on your job? No, right? So every year you work is a failure. Yes or no? No. Every year you work towards something, towards a goal, right? Which is to get a promotion, to be able to take care of your family, to be able, provide the house for them or take care of your parents. You work towards a goal. It's not a failure. It's steps to success. You know, and if you've never, I don't want to make it personal. So there's always steps to it. You know, Michael Jordan played 15 years, won 6 championships. The other 9 years was a failure? That's what you're telling me? No, I'm asking you a question. Yes or no? Okay, exactly. So why are you asking me that question? It's a wrong question. There's no failure in sports. You know, there's good days, bad days. Some days you are able to be successful, some days you're not. Some days it's your turn, some days it's not your turn. And that's what sports is about. You don't always win.
All right. So a lot to break down there from what Giannis said to this reporter. And you heard a little bit in the clip there. He asked him that question last year because the Bucks were eliminated in the playoffs last year. They won a championship 2 years prior. They hadn't won a championship before that in decades, right, as a franchise. Some background and context before Nick and I give our kind of takes on this overarching question about what is success versus what is failure, what defines either. Giannis Antetokounmpo has developed into one of the NBA, if not the game of basketball's best players, right? He's a 7-time All-Star. He's a 6-time All-NBA. He's an NBA champion. Like I mentioned, they won the championship a few years ago. He's also won an MVP. He's won a title. He's been on the All-Rookie team. He's really blossomed, right? And he's become this, elite athlete, scorer, pretty much everything in terms of a must-watch player for the league. And one of the top, let's say, 10 players in the league that the NBA has been marketing, not only because, as you heard a little bit of his accent there, obviously he was born in Greece and he speaks Greek. So being able to market a player overseas and somebody that is so talented like him is great, not only for the domestic game because he plays in a smaller market in Milwaukee, but also for the global game, right? We know how much the NBA does overseas to market their game. So there's a lot in terms of what he's accomplished from a success standpoint, just getting himself to become one of the staples of the league, right? Then there's the question about failure. So Nick, we're going to get into this right now. I want to give my takes first because I feel like you and I are maybe going to think the same, and I'm going to explain why in a second. But when I heard this reaction and specifically the clip, a lot of things ran through my head. There was first the journalistic question part of it, right? Then there was the sports part of it, right? Which is, again, highly subjective. We'll get into that in a second. And then there's the overarching question about what do you define as successful? What are the steps to take in terms of failing to become successful, right? So I'm going to break mine down into 3 parts. The first part is the journalistic part. A lot of people are saying the question is lazy. I think the question that sports writers struggle with is, I don't know if I want to ask this question, but I know fans would want to ask this question if they were sitting in my position. I've dealt with that before. Again, as a sports reporter, I worked at sportsnetwork.com when I first started my career in journalism. It was the first job I actually had out of college before Fox News, funny enough. and I worked as a sports stringer. So I've asked Allen Iverson questions after a loss. Like I've actually done this to NBA players, not asked about success versus failure, but just asked them a question that I would want to know as a fan of potentially that team, because I'm representing the voice of the fans out there. So that argument lives in the journalism world in terms of whether or not that question is lazy. He said, "You asked me this question last year, Eric. Well, last year you guys got eliminated. This year you got eliminated one round earlier. So I think the question is valid. But like I mentioned before, it's all subjective because a fan, me, if I was a fan of the Milwaukee Bucks, I would say it's a failure, mainly because they had the best record in the Eastern Conference. They had him healthy, and then they lose to a team that was struggling to not only make the playoffs, had to win a playing game to get in, but they lost at home. They lost 2 games at home. So in that sense, maybe it's a failure. Now, let's get into the middle part of this, right? Which is the sports part. It feeds in perfectly because the sports part, the Bucks were not a very good team when Giannis was drafted, right? Typically, if you're not a good team, you're drafting a little bit higher up, right? So you can get somebody that can eventually help your team. Giannis wasn't that player because he was drafted later on, but he developed into that player. And now they've started to put some pieces around him where the team started to build up. They made the playoffs. Then they would get bounced in the playoffs. So you guys get experience, right? Nothing better than learning on the fly, right? So you throw in some players into the deep end. And eventually, 2 years ago, it culminated in winning a championship. And he was even vocal at the podium saying that this is the way you do it, right? You stay with the team that drafted you, that believed in you. You get people to come to your city, and then you build this the right way. So everybody, that feel good story of 2 years ago of actually doing it, now 2 years later, people are asking, because they were a favorite again this year, is it a failure because they lost in the first round? Again, putting back the sports fan hat on, you could say it is. Putting on the sports athlete hat on, like Giannis is doing, it's not a failure. He's one of the top 10 players in the world. He averaged 31 points per game this year. That's a really high average. He potentially was in line for a bunch of postseason awards. His team was the number 1 overall seed and won their division. So obviously in the regular season, they achieved a lot of success. In the postseason, they did not achieve a lot of success. Now we get to the third part, the overarching question, which is, and he said there, and I love that he said, I don't want to make this personal. And he asked him a comparison about Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan played 15 years. 6 of those years, he won a title. 9 of them, he didn't win anything. Are those 9 years failures? So my overarching question, it'll feed into you, Nick, is what do you define as successful or a failure? Because he even asked him, how many times have you gotten a promotion? Did you get promoted this year? No, then is your life a failure? And there is some truth behind that, right? I didn't get promoted this year. I didn't get promoted the year prior. Is my life a failure? But I've done other things that I feel put me on the path to success. But again, success is subjective. Is it monetary? Is it where you want to be in terms of your career trajectory? Like, what is it that you define as successful? And I think neither guy in that conversation could define success for the other, because again, back to my overall point, it's really subjective. So I look at it from the 3 parts of this: the journalistic question part of it, the sports part of it, and really the overarching life question. And I think I came away from it so appreciative of the answer, but I didn't understand the ire of people taking it out on a journalist for asking a question that, again, Milwaukee Bucks fans are probably going to want to ask, which was, hey, we were favored and we lost to a team that barely got into the playoffs. What were some of your takeaways when you heard Giannis give that answer to the journalist?
Yeah, similar to you, there's a couple of layers to it that appeared to me. I mean, first, my initial reaction to people who are unhappy with the question is, the journalist is in the same world that you and I are, Mike. Yeah, Mike, you are well known of the two of us of engaging with people, on social media that have sometimes not the most savory things to say about our show, and something you and I talk offline about is, it's the easiest thing in the world to criticize another person's program, their guests. We have people that you and I know personally that like to do this. And what I like to tell those folks is simply go grab a mic and RSS feed and create your own content. Leave me alone. It's I was going to say it's not that hard, but that's nonsense. It is actually hard. It takes work. And not everyone's able to do it. So So there's always an audience of people who are never going to be happy. Will always come back to this from the education world, where failure is often hidden. It's often not comfortable to talk about failure. It's something we just tried to avoid. I know the company I work for, Educate, our second core value has the word failure in it. And many times when I've done interviews or people are in their first year, they talk about their experiences at the company. Our second value of being open, humble, and being open and humble, right? Fail fast, learn faster. That is literally our value as a company. People are uncomfortable with the word failure, and I've heard that multiple times. But it's important because it's important to own failure, because failure, recognizing that you did not achieve your goal and there's an opportunity to grow from that is the opportunity. When Giannis downplays the concept of failure, there is a certain sense of avoidance. And that's something I've heard in education often, that we have different measures for success, and failure is something we don't necessarily sort of come up with. And that's ridiculous. If you have a goal and you fall short of it, you have failed. That's it. And it's not a bad thing, because on the other side of it, Giannis is absolutely correct. You're not always going to win. It's impossible. No one ever does. In baseball, no one's ever won 162 games, right? In the NBA, no one's ever won 82 games. In the history of professional sports, the only undefeated team I can think of is the 1972 Miami Dolphins that went 13 or 14-0, right? It's a short 17. Yeah. 17. Thank you. But that's it. But other teams that have won championships have experienced some failure along the way. It's part of the process. It almost seemed as though Giannis was triggered by that word. And again, he's in a pretty raw place. He just lost the playoff series. And you're the top seed against the 8th seed. Yes, Giannis, as much a fan I am of his work, that is a failure. That you came up short. I think about a team like the Dallas Mavericks. 2011, they won their championship. They've never been heard from since then. And the question I would ask that team and their owner is, since that championship, has every season since then been considered a loss or considered a failure? I would hope so. You've reached the mountaintop once. Is not the goal to continue to do that, to continue to achieve that?
Right.
You're a Yankees fan, right? The Yankees have always been known as an organization that when winning a title has not been achieved, the season's considered a failure. The late George Steinbrenner talked often about it. And what did that mean to fans and to the organization? Spend the money, get better players, get better, because winning the title was the be all end all. And whether you're a fan of the Yankees or not, that was simply how the organization, at least back then, that was the mindset. In short, or to wrap here, for me, yeah, it's important to embrace failure, because by admitting when you've come up short, it's additional incentive to meet those goals and to recognize how to grow from that. And if we certainly paid attention to that in the education space, I think we'd have our students better off. And if we think about that comfortably in the professional space, I think we'd recognize we have a long way to go.
Yeah. No, I mean, like I said, I really think that it's multi-layered. And again, it's all subjective. It all depends on what you define as successful and failure. But you know what? We'd love to hear from you. Email us, canwepleasetalkpodcast@gmail.com. If you have a take, not only on what Giannis said about the overarching question, but even a sports take. Obviously, Nick and I are both sports fans. We'd love to hear that and read those comments on air. Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it. And we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.